Welcome to the Parent Matters podcast, where we help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of parenting and equip you with tools to confidently parent your children. I'm Susan Stutzman, and today we're talking about tips for managing long weekends and long holiday break expectations. And to help me do that, I've asked Keri Sawyer, my friend, a child therapist, a therapy practice owner, and mother, to join me. Welcome to the show, Keri.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Keri, before we get started, can you share with our listeners a little bit about your work and life, as well as what you're passionate about?
Yeah, I would love to. So I run a child and adolescent practice called Bloom Child Therapists, and we're in Parker, Colorado. And we specialize in the ages 2 to 18 actually. And I use play therapy as my primary mode of therapy, specifically because it does relate to all my passions, because I've always been a very experiential healer myself, but also have seen that that's something I tend to want to facilitate for other people more frequently than not, because I just can see the whole body experience kind of come to a beautiful place, a more full healing when things are a little bit more movement oriented. So that's where I find my passion in therapy and with families and kids. And I have two kiddos of my own, so it is just a wonderful little pairing of doing what I do. And then I'm really excited to talk about these long weekends, because it's something that I myself have been thinking about and doing with my kiddos. As well as with my clients for a couple of years now. So I'm excited.
Awesome. Oh, well, thank you. And as you know, and you just mentioned, I invited you here to talk specifically about the tips for managing long weekends. And sometimes it can be overwhelming, right? So let's just jump right in and talk. Our audience is mainly parents and caregivers. And so what I was thinking was if we could walk through some things that we know as therapists about brain structure and about how creating structure versus unstructured expectations can be great or can be hard. And I'm just curious, any of your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So one of the big things that I constantly am thinking about as a framework myself is the first place I go to is that each child has such a unique brain, as well as, whether it's just their temperament, it's who they are, but then their age. And so what I typically like to do with my parents and my clients is first sort of hone in on who is your child and how will they respond to certain kinds of structure, right? So, Susan, I know you also work with population who have kiddos who might have a diagnosis or at least tendencies with the ASD diagnosis, that a child that might be on the spectrum, or even just kiddos that have like an ADHD type of tendency. And so I'm thinking specifically about them when I say this, but each child's brain, the neurodiversity of each child is so unique that what I think about when it comes to structure is that structure looks different for each family. And so when I'm thinking about that, I then go to what's going to be the most productive for this kiddo. And so I think of it as that first. And then second, I do really believe in making that unknown known when it comes to a long weekend or a holiday, so that we can help minimize some of the moments of anxiety and dysregulation that might come up in that weekend. And I'm curious what you think of those things too, because I know you work with so many kids, neurodiversity, but specifically the ones that we have to do things a little bit differently with structure about there.
Yeah, no, I think that what you said is great. I think that just explaining for our listeners a little bit about regulation could be helpful, is that this is how I tend to think of it, and I'd love your take on this too, Keri, is that not every kid is going to show anxiety or feelings of discomfort, if you will, in changes of schedule to the same extent. But when we think about dysregulation, we have to think about the word regulation. And I like to think of a thermostat when I talk about regulation, kind of like, we're trying to always get back to the same temperature. We're creatures of habit. And so our bodies are always trying to regulate back to 98.6 or whatever temperature we run at. And so if something has changed, sometimes we have to resource it, or we have to plan ahead so that we can make sure that we don't, we aren't running cold or running hot, or if we have a fever, getting it so that we can get back to balance or back to where we are. I'm just thinking about like here, I don't know what it's like in Colorado right now, but it's like 60 degrees here, maybe. But it was 42 last night. And, and so then like to regulate, right? Like my thermostat turned on the heat last night, where last week it was so warm, it turned on the air conditioner to stay at a temperature of 68 or 70. And so sometimes we need certain things that are predictable, but sometimes we have other needs too, right? Like heat or cool, sweater or shorts. And so really knowing your child, right? Knowing the temperature, knowing what's going to happen, I think is really helpful, because sometimes it can be, as a parent, we're like, oh, amazing, it's break, right? Like we get a weekend off, and our kids, they do something and it feels overwhelming, and it's hard for them to get back into that regulated space, right? Because we've been unstructured to what their structure normally is. And so then expectations can be off. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think that, I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's so true that each kid's type of regulation might look different. I even think of just the idea of, as we're trying to kind of navigate those weekends, letting ourselves have some flexibility is big, but just knowing that working within our own strengths as parents, as well as the strength of each of our kiddos, if you have multiples, just knowing that there are strengths that we all exhibit. So maybe if you have a kid that's extremely good with being creative and knowing how to see things visually, they're such a visual learner, then you definitely want to do something where you draw out, the expectations of the weekend, right? That would be within their wheelhouse. That would be within their values. That would be within their strengths. So that would be something that I would definitely do for a kiddo like that, as opposed to, you have a kiddo that they can only retain and handle the next 2 hours of knowledge. So you just sort of say like, okay, here's what we're going to do for tonight. We're not going to have to necessarily go into tomorrow, but let me just give you like a quick overview of you can expect this for the weekend in a general sense, but I'll remind you again right before bed or right when we wake up, right? So each kiddo can be different. And I think that that's something that we as parents can use to our benefit if we really hone in on those types of things and our strengths. I also think about like, don't forget the parent strength in that as well, where I feel like for me, I'm like, if I don't accomplish things in the first 4 hours of the day, it's going to be tough to get through the rest of the day. So mornings, if that's a time where you have to get something done, or if, sometimes these long weekends, some kids have like a task or two for school, maybe do that in the morning if you're freshest.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was thinking about is like, even for myself as a parent, or even like, sometimes I have opportunities we have, friends over. And so then you're caregiving as well, or, my kids are getting older, so it's not as, like you're the caregiver. It's like, they're just playing, but there is that somewhat, right? It's like, sometimes kids are like, oh, I want to have a really late night. But for me as the parent, that might not be helpful, because then the next morning's thrown off, or I have to stay up and the margin that I have to be able to help them get back into a different schedule when they go back to school or when the break
Yeah.
is over can really be tricky. So I've realized like creating structure for myself as the parent or guardian
Mm.
along with the child. So
Hmm.
allowing some unstructure, right? But
Hmm.
giving myself
Definitely.
this sense of realizing like what's my budget. So I've been reading
Mm.
lately, and I'm curious if you've ever read this book, but I've been reading a number of books by Lisa Feldman Barrett, and she wrote this book called How Emotions Are Made,
Ooh, I haven't read that.
and she has things on YouTube, and she is I'm not exactly sure if she's a Harvard medical doctor or if she's a graduate. Anyway,
Mm.
she's a huge neuroscientist in the field.
Hmm.
However, one of the things that she purports in her books, so there's like also another book that I really like, 7.5 lessons from the brain, and then
Ooh.
some other things. And it's about how we have a budget,
Mm.
and it's we don't always realize that we're only capable
Mm.
of so much. And so it's like
Hmm.
if you are managing money and you have $100 to spend for the day, it could be really helpful to not always plan to spend all 100, even though if you don't spend it all in one day, you lose it. It's not like it carries over.
Yeah.
Because you never know what can happen. You don't want to spend too little, but you don't want to spend your max always, because then
Mm.
you don't have any margin. And,
Hmm.
I've been thinking about this concept and how a lot of parents that I know oftentimes run on borrowed money or
Yeah.
borrowed budget, right? Just
Yeah.
because there's so many things. Yes, no, I know, like myself too. And it's like we're really good at overspending, basically.
Hmm.
And how can I create more and more margin in my life so that
Mm.
when unexpected things come up, I've actually structured a portion that I can have to spend so I'm not overspending every day. Now, I mean,
Hmm.
there's things that happen, right? But especially with changes in schedule, I've been playing around with this idea, thinking about it with my kids. Like, what's their budget, right? Like, they might,
Hmm.
like, my budget's almost done. How much, like, I need to
Yeah.
stop. And it's okay to say that. And modeling is really important so that they too
Hmm.
don't learn to just overspend, overspend, overspend.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Hmm.
Yeah, and so I'm curious, like in dealing with
Hmm.
different body budgets and children,
Hmm.
and people having different limits, right? Like you were talking about kids that are maybe on the ASD or autism spectrum
Hmm.
disorder tendencies, or actually have that diagnosis. Kids with
Hmm.
ADHD, kids with ODD, kids with
Hmm.
different types of anxiety or
Hmm.
depression. Like it can, depending on what your family structure or makeup looks like, everybody can have different budgets. And so I'm just
Hmm.
curious, like in your own work and as a parent, how you prioritize and think about helping families with multiple kids.
Hmm. Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, that dynamic, you have one kid and the dynamic is one way because there's, just a few of you in the family, but then you have a second kid and the dynamic just keeps changing, right? And each kid is so different usually, which is such a fun little gift. um, but I really actually, to your point of just these budgets, I would say, thinking about each kid as having that certain level of ability. Each person's, what we, in that neuroscience world, talk about their window of tolerance, the amount that they can handle before they feel like they might be flooded or things are too much. The amount of sensory input each person can handle. I think what I typically like to do with parents is help them find kind of a little bit of a niche for each kiddo or each person in the family to find their time of peace in the weekend or the time over that long stretch, just sort of their what is their thing that they really need. And so it's a puzzle. I mean, that's the easiest and probably simplest way to say it, but it is a puzzle because for me and with my own kiddos, I'm having to juggle a little bit of like, I know that this kid needs this, but how can I put that into the puzzle of where this other child needs a little bit more interaction at this time? And so it is sort of finding a little bit of a balance of a schedule. But I like what you said, and specifically with that, you know, I know it's a worker model and I forget the words of it specifically, but I remember thinking of it as like you have red flag moments in a day, yellow flag, and green flag, right? Green can be more the scheduled things in a day. And so trying to sort of fill your day with like, okay, here's my to do list of green things that I know will work really well, but then letting yourself have like 3 or 4 yellow things in there. And yellow is slightly less planned. You're sort of going for something and you're like, we'll see what happens. I have the energy to do that with each kiddo. But then you try to only have like one red flag thing in a day. And you think about like a fire drill, right? Things you can't really plan for. And so those are the ones where you're like, okay, how do I manage my day where I'm not just setting my family up for, I know this kiddo has a really hard time, maybe just like with loud noises, even something as simple as that. But, and then bringing them all to like this big concert where they're going to get so overstimulated, there's going to be a red flag meltdown, right? So just sort of saying like, let's try to plan out and say this might be a red flag moment with one kiddo, and trying to sort of gauge how many red flag moments are building up just based off of the schedule you might have for the weekend. Um, so I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but I do think that there's
I'm like, like red flag moments.
addition.
Yeah, like if it's gonna be red flag, I mean, if there's like gonna be so many red flags, right? Like
Mhm.
it's a helpful way to like just take stock in, well, what do I really want out of this weekend, right? I know
Yeah.
like at the time that we're recording this, last weekend was Indigenous Peoples Day, Christopher Columbus. And here the elementary schools have the Monday off. And
Mhm.
my kiddos, my son had a birthday party I was hosting, and my kids went to another birthday party. So the weekend was sandwiched. Like Saturday was birthday party, Monday was birthday party. A number of my family members showed up, and we offered dinner. And so the expectation of giving that to them was one I wanted, but it was also it took from my budget, right? And so
Mhm.
I noticed just even in myself, like as I was, as we were having dinner, like I had my husband go grab some food at the grocery store. I'm learning to ask for more help. Like, can you do this? So my dad grilled the chicken, like it wasn't like I had to do it all, but realizing, if we're going to have a family dinner with 15 people, I'm going to need some help, and otherwise I'm going to stretch or overspend. And so, and
Mhm.
like, it could have turned into a red flag moment, right? Like where
Mhm.
inside of me, it's too much. Or if I expected my kids to do a certain thing, but
Mhm.
instead, I know that like even thinking about this birthday party that I was hosting, there was a really helpful, just kind of like methodical, like, okay, so it's going to be low key. It's going to be these types of things, making sure that like
Mhm.
there weren't a ton of things that could turn into a red flag.
Mhm. Totally.
But it doesn't always go
Totally.
that way. But I think
Yeah.
that too, like realizing like, okay, sometimes it's also important to have like a plan if you're going to overspend. Like I could have
Yeah.
said, it's not going to work to have dinner here with the family, but we can go out to pizza, right?
Mhm.
Like how can I also make sure that I'm holding my staying in that, green flag moments, green
Yeah.
zone, those types of things.
Yeah.
Because I feel like then managing expectations of
Mhm.
myself as a parent or guardian is the most important thing so that I can model it to the children in my life. Because if I
Mhm.
can't manage expectations, how am I expecting them to? And I want to teach my children. I want to make sure that the children that are part of my life can see this
Mhm.
is a way that you can manage expectations with structure, with unstructure, when a red
Mhm.
flag moment comes up, when a yellow flag moment
Mhm.
comes up, when you run out of
Mhm.
your money, your budget,
Yeah.
when you have extra to spend, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes you do have extra to spend and you have surprise moments. Like I had a little extra to spend,
Mhm.
and when my family, was there, it was like, oh, I actually had a lovely time, sitting down and eating because
Mhm.
I didn't take it upon myself to do everything. So
Yeah.
I know that there's lots that goes into it, but I'm curious, like, what are
Mhm.
some tips or strategies that you've found in your own personal life, but as a mother, but also with clients that have helped you as you've thought about this concept of managing
Mhm.
expectations, especially for holiday weekends where
Yeah.
there's a lot of parties or,
Mhm.
events. I'm thinking about
Mhm.
Christmas coming up.
Mhm.
How do we manage expectations for winter break and
Yeah.
all of these, moving parts where kids like sometimes families go on vacation and there's presents and there's
Mhm.
disappointment and there's excitement and happiness and,
Mhm.
you know, all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think my biggest tip to parents, and I kind of giggle as I say it, is just like don't expect it to be perfect. And expect to have this be a time where as we're doing our best, right? Like I know sometimes some of my favorite weekends I end up going, "Oh, is that just my favorite because I like managed it really well?" Like that I get so excited about it. But like it's also about really just enjoying our family too. So in those times where we're feeling like the pressure to be this perfect parent or just to do it so well, have the perfect formula, remembering that part of this whole thing is that we're trying to grow these, I always say, like happy, healthy, safe children. And so a lot of that has to do with, if something goes wrong, maybe like showing them and modeling how you reset, right? So being aware of that in the forefront of we're going to structure this, we're going to do our best to make this a green flags only sprint, like break time, right? But there's going to be these red flags that come up. And so when that happens, it's how we respond to it that's going to be really important. And
And
so kind of
do you have any like ways that you
mhm,
um, like have practiced that you are going to respond that you
mhm,
found particularly helpful? Because I know there's lots of different things you could do, but like really
mhm.
getting practical, what are some
Yeah.
of those ways that you found to be helpful?
Yeah. So I like the phrase, if something comes up and you can't do something about it immediately with a kiddo and you're like, whoa, something, let's just say like they break, they're just getting crazy. They break something in the house over this long weekend and you're tapped out. So for me, it would be like I love you so much. That's the phrase I always start with. Have a little phrase. I love you so much, or hey, we're going to get through this type of thing. I'm not exactly sure how to handle this right now, but we're going to figure it out. Right. So having a moment where you're allowed to not know exactly how to handle that moment if things are getting a little chaotic. I really like having those types of things set in place beforehand so that you don't go and say like you're not like flying off the handle, right? You're not like, oh, I can't handle this. Like, go to your room. I can't do this. Just being like, whoa, I don't actually know exactly how to handle this right now. You can use your own words, but just saying like, "Ooh, I'm not sure what to do, but I love you so much. We're gonna figure this out." I like having that in my tool belt for the weekend or the long holiday, as well as in terms of just managing that expectation. I would say just having sort of your own kind of expectation maybe written out so that you can sort of say like, oh, is this realistic? Here's the areas that might be realistic. here are the areas that might not be realistic. And just sort of then holding those a little bit more loosely and saying those would be like really beneficial moments if I could do that, or really exciting moments, but not saying like this must happen for this to be a good break with my kids. I think that can really help us set expectations and say, all right, we have 3 things that have to be accomplished this weekend or this week, right? But not necessarily having it be a million things. So keep that to-do list a little bit shorter.
Yeah. One thing that I have been thinking about too is we can always clean up later. Because I think that one of the hard things is, it's nice to have things all in order in your home, especially when you're taking a break, right? But we're not going to. Typically, I have 3 kids. I know, you have 2, and if they're all home, it's going to look different than if they're not. If they're all home and it's not a school day, they might want to do art all over the dining room table and the kitchen table. And, like one of my daughters is really into, making her own food. And so it's, that's totally fine, but it's going to look super different. And so like resourcing myself to manage my expectations of, yeah, the house might be dirty, but maybe we can have, okay, we're going to stop or we're going to put everything away by 7:00 at night. If you want to watch a show or you want to watch a movie, on this, holiday break, like you can keep certain things out, but then there are certain things that we all share this space. And so cleaning up could be really helpful.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Like, we'll get to that.
Yes.
Doesn't need to happen.
Well, this has been really fun to be able to chat with you about this. I want to share with our listeners that one of my colleagues here at Kid Matters has created kind of like a map. It's literally 6 blocks with little squares with a little square inside, so you can check off what you've done, and so you can write in it or you can draw. You can get as creative or as simple as you want. It's a very simplistic map, but I've found that it's really helpful to be able to provide kids and parents and caregivers a way to set expectations and plans for different types of schedules. It's super simple and customizable, but it's a helpful resource to use as a jumping off point in creating structure, managing expectations during the long weekend. And since I just talked to Keri about this and she mentioned yellow flag, red flag, green flag, it would be cool too if you like either wrote the stuff in the green, yellow, or red color or put the little flag on it. Or if you're more into the budget, concept, putting like, this is going to cost me 50 of my 100 pennies, right? Like, so that you can kind of begin to play around with these concepts and try it out and see what works for you, what works for your family. So if you want to check that out, you can follow the link below to download your own free printable copy today. And before we go, Keri, I not only want to just say thank you so much for joining me, but can you tell our listeners a little bit about where they can get in touch with you or find more about you if they want to chat with you or if they're looking for a counselor in Colorado?
Yeah. So the best way to do that is to go to our website, bloomchildtherapists.com. And if you were to just call one of the numbers that's in our intake form request, you'll get through to either me or somebody on our team, and just you can talk to me specifically or get set up with somebody here. But we would love to support you in Colorado. We also have myself and one of our other therapists is licensed in Illinois as well. So we'd love to even chat with you if you're in Illinois.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you, Keri, for joining me. And thank you all for listening. If you found this conversation useful, please subscribe to the podcast and join me again next time for the Parent Matters podcast, where we always remind you, don't parent alone. Please remember the topics discussed in this podcast should be considered a matter of personal opinion. They do not reflect professional advice. If you or your child is in need of mental health counseling support, please search out a licensed counselor in your area.